Hello and welcome back to our series of studies on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who is credited along with Nietzsche as the founder of the philosophical school called existentialism. So we're doing a long series of studies. This is the number 7 study, the 7th study. And it's based on my book on Soren Kierkegaard. The book is called Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. This is a book that can be purchased on Amazon.com. And if you want to purchase the book, just go to Amazon.com and do a search with my name, Ross M. Bagne, Bagne, and you can purchase a copy for $19.99, or I can send you a signed, an autographed copy of the book for $20, and you'll save by emailing me about $5-6 or so, because the price is the same, but Amazon charges postage and handling. And I don't charge handling and postage. So you can email me, and my email address is ross, R-O-S-S, @ynet.net. This is a continuation of a study that we first began at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cheyenne, Wyoming, way back in 2010, October 2010. And we did not get through the entire book, so I'm hoping now we can continue the book sometime later on this year at St. Paul's, probably in September or October. That will all depend on the education committee at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cheyenne. But in the meantime, I wanted to do a complete series of this book from beginning to end, starting with the introduction and going all the way through 458 pages of my book, because some of the people who have purchased this book have told me that there needs to be a deeper, more thorough explanation of SK. And of course, that does not surprise me in the least, because the book that I wrote on SK is really meant to be just an introduction, and not a replacement, but an introduction to a more thorough examination of what SK was all about, because it's very hard to summarize a genius like SK. But I decided that I could fulfill this request on the internet, and all of these videos are being uploaded to YouTube, and all the links to these studies can be found on my Facebook page. If you go to facebook.com and type in my name, Ross M. Bagne, B-A-G-N-E, you'll come up with all the links to all of our studies. So far we've done 6, and this will be number 7. And I think it's an historical event. I think it will be very important in future years and in future generations to the real understanding of SK. And that's one of the reasons I'm putting this on the internet, is to help people understand the true nature of SK's authorship, especially his aesthetic and philosophical works. So we pick up here on page 74. And what I do next in this chapter is really summarize, give an overall summary of all of SK's aesthetic and philosophical works, to put it kind of into a thumbnail or a brief exposition. of what S.K. was all about in his aesthetic and philosophical works. And we're talking about the nature of his understanding of indirect communication. And in the last study we did, study 6, we talked about the reasons for indirect communication. Now I wish to go into how he applied this to his aesthetic and philosophical works. For all the reasons that we looked at in study number 6, S.K. developed a complex system of indirect communication and his pseudonyms who serve to illustrate and explain his ultimate views. The first book we're going to look into is going to be Either Or Volumes 1 and Volume 2, which describe the relationship between the aesthetic life view and the ethical. And Either Or and later Stages on Life's Way are great examples of the distance that S.K. tried to place between himself and his reader. The two authors of Either Or Volumes 1 and 2 are anonymous. The two books are edited by a certain Victor Eremita, and it is a good example of the delight that S.K. took in creating puzzles within puzzles. And truly, also for anyone who wants to become a talented author, to write a short story or a novel, is the study of S.K.'s approach to creating these poetic creations, and how, in Aristotelian terms, concealment and then finally enlightenment or revelation, concealment and revelation, how these work together in poetics. So to begin with Either Or, which is the first book we will get into here pretty soon, the editor, Victor Eremita, found the papers that make up the book Either Or in a secretary, that is, a desk that he had bought in a furniture shop. In the course of time, Victor Eremita discovered the papers in the desk. The author of the papers that make up Volume 1 were totally untraceable to any author. The papers that make up Volume 2, Victor Eremita could only identify with the name of William, who was a magistrate in the municipal court that he could not identify. The significance of the two authors identifies that the authors identify is this: the author of Volume 1, being an aesthetic individual, has not yet chosen himself through despair. So therefore he has no identity, because he has not yet chosen himself out of the possibilities of existence. The author of Volume 2 is an author who has chosen himself through despair and thus has an identity called Judge William. To these two authors, Victor Eremita ascribes the designations of Author A and Author B. Volume 1 describes an aesthetic existence which S.K. actually, Author A, describes as an imaginative existence in aesthetic passion and therefore paradoxical, colliding with time. It is in its maximum despair. It is therefore not existence but an existential possibility tending toward existence. Volume 2 of Either Or describes an ethicist who has chosen himself through despair. This person is no longer a complex series of possibilities, but a person who has chosen to become his concrete self, which can be variously described as the real self or his eternal or God-given self. The conclusion that author B reaches in the end of Either Or, Volume 2, is only the truth which edifies is truth for you. This is an essential predicate relating to the truth as inwardness. Its decisive characterization as edifying for you, i.e., for the subject. And this constitutes its essential difference from all objective knowledge, in that the subjectivity itself becomes the mark of the truth. And this is SK's definition of truth, which we will get into a lot further depth when we get into the postscript. SK's next book is to pick up where this left off, is Fear and Trembling by the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio. And this continues where Volume 2 of Either Or leaves off. In this book, SK represents the specifically God relationship coming into being. This book stresses the importance of the God relationship above everything, including the universal laws of the Ten Commandments. This book describes the state of mind of someone, specifically in this case Abraham, in relationship to God, where not even the normal ethical relationship between a father and a son is binding, but where the higher requirement to love God above all things, even to the extent of hating mother and father, has come into being. That is the specifically Christian religion. Now, the significance of the name Johannes de Silentio has to do with the relationship between concealment in the aesthetic sphere, as represented in Either Or Volume 1, and concealment in the Christian religious sphere. In the aesthetic sphere, concealment is expressed in psychological terms in the individual as introversion, morbid reserve, inwardness, with a jammed lock, etc. Because in this stage, the individual is centered and obsessed with his own self. He has not yet chosen to choose himself out of his self-centered life in inwardness, and therefore also feels the need to dwell within himself, conceal himself, or in a word, to cover himself up. And thus he remains in the aesthetic sphere. So the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio contrasts the concealment in the religious sphere, Christianity, with the concealment in the aesthetic sphere. In the concealment of someone in the teleological suspension of the ethical, that is, in a trial of faith, and of course, in this case, in Fear and Trembling, he uses Abraham. And in this trial, he's subject to fear and trembling. In Abraham, if he had tried to make himself understood to anyone, he was completely alone. He could not do this. He could not make himself understood to anyone. So he kept himself in concealment religiously, whereas the aesthetic person keeps himself in concealment for self-centered reasons. Abraham was completely alone in this trial in which God had given to his son. If he had tried to explain his purpose to anyone, they would have thought him to be crazy. Nobody could understand what he was about to do, not even Isaac. And this was a major part of Abraham's trial, that he was all alone about it. I mean, if he had said anything to Sarah, that he was going to go out and sacrifice his son, Sarah would have done everything in her might, in her power, to prevent this from happening. So he realized he could not reveal this trial that God had given him. Not only not to Sarah, Sarah, but he could not reveal it to his servants or to Isaac. So that's the concealment in the teleological suspension of the ethical. So, okay, we have these books so far. We have Either Or Volume 1 and Either Or Volume 2, and then Fear and Trembling. Here is how Kierkegaard summarizes his authorship to this point. The ethical constitutes the temptation. The God relationship has come into being. The eminence of ethical despair has been broken through. The leap is posited. The absurd constitutes the notification. The absurd was to love God above all things, even to the point of sacrificing Isaac. Now, here we have to point out in Fear and Trembling, he's really talking about the leap of faith to the Christian religion. And in SK's life, you could say that he had 3 conversions. The first conversion was from the aesthetic to the religiousness, the deist religion, natural religion, whatever you want to call it. And then the second leap was from the religiousness A to religiousness B. And the final leap that he personally experienced was a leap of faith, in which, in his final conversion, he realized his sins were not only forgiven by God, but forgotten. Walter Lowry explains this final stage of SK's faith in this way from his journals. Wednesday, April 19th, 1848. My whole nature is changed. My closeness and reservedness are broken. I must speak. Great God, grant me grace. This is indeed true. That is indeed true. The word that my father said about me. Nothing will come of you as long as you have money. He spoke prophetically. He supposed that I should drink and revel. But not that exactly. No, but what with my mental acumen and melancholy and my money. Oh, what a favorable condition for developing the torments of self-torture in my heart. Now, by God's grace, I shall become myself. I believe now that Christ will help me triumph over my melancholy, and then I shall become a priest. So you can document, actually, if you study SK's biographies, the biographies written about SK, and you study his journals, as having 3 religious experiences throughout his whole life. But in Fear and Trembling, he's talking about the second conversion from the ethical to the Christian religion, which he always called religiousness B. So it's a very complex puzzle that you have to put through to understand SK's writings and his personal life. Because even in his journals, he was not he did not completely reveal himself, which was his character, of course. And he was very honest about himself at the same time, but spoke with an especially religious, that is, I'm sorry, about his religious conversion in obscure terms. So you have to kind of read through the lines and study his the biographies and study his journals to get a better understanding. But now to get back and further explain the second conversion, which is found in Fear and Trembling. That is his conversion to Christianity. It can be found in his writings with respect to the importance SK placed on the concept of repetition. For SK, one of the primary qualities of Christianity was his understanding of the term repetition, and we'll get into that later on, in especially his book Repetition and many other aspects of his thinking, and what an important place repetition meant in all of his philosophical and theological writings. The young man in Repetition summarizes this experience this way. I am again myself, this self which another would not pick up from the road. I possess again. The discord in my nature is resolved. I am again unified. The terrors which found support and nourishment in my pride no longer enter in to distract and separate. Is there not then a repetition? Did I not get everything doubly restored? And what is a repetition of earthly goods which are of no consequence to the spirit? What are they in comparison with such a repetition? Only his children, Job, did not receive again double, because a human life is not a thing that can be duplicated. In that case, only scriptural repetition is possible, although in the temporal life, it is never so perfect as in eternity, which is the true repetition. And repetition was always such a part of all of SK's psychological and epistemological work. So it's one of the most profound and one of the most important of all of SK's concepts. And we'll study this as we go through the rest of the book. Now, the occasion for this conversion, the second conversion, was really, as every commentator on SK knows, was the breakup in his engagement with Regina. The final breakup came on November 3rd, 1847, and is recorded in Kierkegaard's journals in an entry made in 1849. The day that became delight for her, I sat in the church of the Savior. You can see here he's a broken-hearted person, and this crisis in his life led him to a higher sphere of existence in his leap of faith to the Christian faith. So it is clear from everything else that this experience brought him into the beginning of the truly Christian religion. That is what he always called religiousness be. It is very interesting to see that many of his books written about religiousness be were written before this experience, and as Walter Lowry points out, were probably later revised after this experience, because in many respects he was ahead of himself in his authorship, and he also, in some of his books, he anticipated another religion. Some of his books he wrote while he was in the ethical or religiousness A, but anticipated a higher conversion to a deeper faith. Well, suffice it to say that putting all these pieces of this jigsaw puzzle together are difficult, and it's a great problem in understanding SK, and I hope I've done it. I hope I've kind of clarified all of this for anyone who wants to study SK. You have to put together his indirect communication, his journals, his pseudonyms, and it's an incredibly complicated puzzle to put together, but I think Walter Lowry, in his great biography on Kierkegaard, did it probably better than anyone. To go into all the details is beyond the scope of this book, because we could analyze this and write a whole other book on it, but really that's not necessary as far as understanding this book itself. All the elements of this puzzle, however, are important because it helps us to understand the dialectics of faith, that is, the stages or spheres of existence that a person goes through in becoming a Christian. Now, there's a good question as to whether these spheres of existence are experienced in the same way that SK experienced these. He clearly had an aesthetic life, and then an ethical life, and then a specifically religious life. And my personal opinion is no, not everyone goes through these as vividly as SK did. And my opinion is it just depends on how far down that road to perdition a person has come, and how far he has to get back. So I don't think that it's necessarily something that each person who becomes a Christian experiences in himself, but I think all Christians go through this process of existence in one way or another, or to some extent in another. We all have a predominance in our thinking at some time in the aesthetic, and then the ethical, and then the religious, especially religiousness, as we become Christians. Okay. So let's see how much time we have. It's okay. I think we got about 3.5 minutes. Okay, so now I use Timothy in the Bible as a person who did not go down that road to perdition like St. Paul did. St. Paul probably went down that road more than any other Christian that I know of, and he persecuted the Christian faith. And so he had a long, long way to go back, and it took him a long, long time. Timothy, on the other hand, was a person who grew up in a very religious atmosphere with very religious persons who raised him, especially, I think, his mother, St. Paul mentions. And he probably did not have that long, long road to get back to God, which St. Paul did. And to a large extent, SK had that same long road to go back. So I don't think these spheres of existence are always as vivid for every person who ultimately becomes a Christian. But they're all edifying. There's always certain aspects of existence to be learned from each sphere. So let's see. Okay, we've got about 1.5 minutes. Well, I think we should stop the study right now. But what I like to do toward the end of each of these tapes is give a preview of what we're going to get into in the next lesson, because it's a little too late right now to begin a further study. We're going through indirect communication now, and the next stage of his authorship will be to get into the aesthetic sphere of existence, and this is in Either Or Volume 1, and also Stages in Life's Way. And we'll get into In Vino Veritas, for example, in Stages in the Aesthetic World. And then we will go into the ethical sphere of existence. No, I'm sorry. It's the aesthetic stage part 2. Okay. Before we go into the ethical, it's aesthetic stage part 2. And this is his analysis, really gets into the soul of his epistemology. Okay, I will talk to you later. Thanks.